Thank you everybody for joining us again. Third time is the charm. Name is Daniel Tal, and we're just going to jump into it. I have a lot of information to go over, and I'll explain as I'm going along. Here's just, you can see there's a SketchUp image on the front of the screen, and then clicking on the next slide, and I'll wait for the attendee view to actually catch up. And there's the rendered version, and again, that was rendered in SketchUp using a program called Twilight Render, and we'll cover all that. I'm going to skip this part about who I am since we just went over that, but that's Google SketchUp for site design. And yes, this presentation is based on this book. What is rendering? Well, rendering is the act of taking any kind of SketchUp model, or any model for that matter, and this is an interior design model by an interior designer named Kara Letts, and she won this for a competition for Easter seals, and I tweaked the model a little and then I rendered it. So I took this interior model, rendered it in something called Twilight Render, and produced a photorealistic quality to that model. Again, another example, this process that I'm talking about is universal. It doesn't matter what type of model that you're actually working on, the results are going to be the same. So here's this architectural model in SketchUp, and then it's rendered again in an integrated rendering program inside SketchUp to produce a photorealistic result. And again, just to get to the more traditional landscape architecture type of project, here's a park project, and then it's rendered to create a photorealistic effect. And the purpose here is to say, well, given what's going on with all the different rendering programs and SketchUp after so many years, which we'll hopefully talk about at the end, you can render landscape and vegetation at this point without too much brain damage, though sometimes there is, depending on your computer or if you're depending on what you're doing. Rendering in itself is a complex and large topic. That's why the book itself is a reference guide, and I'm not going to mention the book beyond that. But I want to review the basics, and I want to focus on a couple of things. One, my personal take on how I model and how I render is everything needs to be done in SketchUp. And the way that I'm using SketchUp to create these renderings, I can use multiple rendering programs. There's a couple of things that I'm going to try to touch upon at the end, but it's not the focus of this presentation. And you can ask, and let's see if we can get to it, but it's computer specs, post-production, what to do with images after they're rendered. A lot of rendering artists take them into Photoshop or similar programs and adjust them, and then simulated or artificial lighting, which is an example of what you're seeing on this screen. Is the bottom rendering was actually done with simulated bulbs or in the rendering program. But again, those are pretty complex topics in their own right. So I'm going to start with this chart, and if you're not a chart person, don't worry about it. I'm going to show some visual examples, but let's talk about process. I'm all about process. Process is really the key to everything that we're doing as landscape architects anyway, and rendering is no different. So you model in SketchUp. You create your base model. We're going to talk about that. You're going to obtain and apply texture images to it. You're going to add and control the model detail, and then you're going to set the lighting up in SketchUp. What I mean by set lighting is we're just going to use the SketchUp shadow menu to determine how lighting works. Then I talk about an iterative rendering process. You're never going to get the correct rendering on the first shot. That's not the way it works. You have to actually process your image multiple times, tweaking, adjusting, adding details, removing or swapping out textures. So you're going to go through a draft rendering process leading to the final rendering. During the iterative rendering process, what you're actually doing is applying specific values to the texture, to textures and lighting and output, and we'll talk about that in detail as well. And then there's the post-processing part, which we'll talk about again. I know I keep saying we'll talk about it at the end, but we're going to go through some of that right now. So if you don't like diagrams, here's an image about this. Here's some images about this process. Here's the base model in SketchUp. What do I mean by base model? I have 3 buildings. I have my ground plane. It's delineating my open space in the back, my hardscape. I have a pool on the left over there, and that's my base model in SketchUp. I then take this base model, everything has a SketchUp color to it, and I apply textures to it. What are textures? Textures we're going to talk about are images that represent real-world materials. They get scaled in SketchUp to represent real-world materials, and then and those are probably the most important aspects when it comes to rendering, is actually applying successful materials and textures to your model. Then I apply another a layer of detail to my model, and in this case it looks like I've added a lot, but I really have taken 7 components: people, benches, bollards, table and chairs, pedestrian light, and a trees, to really fill up the scene to create context for my rendering. And again, I'll elaborate on all these aspects as I keep going on. Then prior to rendering, again, I'm still in SketchUp here, I turn on the SketchUp Shadows, and the way the rendering programs work is whatever you set the SketchUp Shadows to be is how they're going to render. What's nice about a lot of rendering programs now is you don't have to turn the shadows on or keep them on, but what I'm doing here is assessing the scene as I'm looking at it prior to rendering. I've turned off the SketchUp edges, I've turned on a little bit of fog, and that actually starts giving me this notion of what this photoreal image is going to start looking like. Then we talk about, after I set all that in SketchUp, I start applying the rendering values. Here, I'm actually showing 3 separate rendering programs. On the left is Podium, in the middle is Shaderlight, and on the right is Twilight Render. Those are the 3 that I'm just referencing. There's many more, we'll talk about that. And their menus are really just very simple plug-in interfaces within SketchUp that let you actually start applying these texture values to the materials. And the values you're going to apply is how textures render, the final output, the quality of the image, and what kind of lighting. And again, here's another example of the rendering plugins and just the secondary menu. And usually when you're rendering and doing an exterior rendering, you're only really going through a couple of menus, which is nice because it lets you quickly lead to the rendering. So talking about the draft rendering process. I know when I first started rendering, I was like, oh God, you know, I created my first render, and you could see my first render here on the top left. The windows are too dark. My green space looks like a pool. My buildings look flat. The view doesn't look necessarily correct, but that's part of the rendering process and learning how to render, and that's something you have to be patient with. The way that you want to do the draft rendering process is you set up everything so it's fast. The renders get processed very quickly, so you can assess the renders, make your changes, and then re-render the entire thing. So here I've gone through 5 different iterations of rendering, adjusting lighting, adjusting the texture values. You can see I got my windows much better in the top right and the bottom images here, and the same with my green space on the back, and also the amount of detail that's visible. And then it takes me to my final rendered image here. We'll wait for a second as it catches up for everybody. Again, I can see an audience view of how fast images are showing, so sorry if I have to wait for that. But again, there's the final rendered image. And then I can take my final rendered image and I bring it into Photoshop and make some adjustments to it. They're very subtle. In this case, the most obvious difference is actually adding a sky background, but I've added some haze. I've tweaked or adjusted the water in the pool at the bottom left, so it's a little bit more realistic, and that really sums up the entire rendering process in a nutshell. But let's delve into the details of this. Oh, sorry, before I do that, let's talk about rendering programs. So there's 2 types of rendering programs. There's studio rendering programs like 3ds Max, Karakithya, and I'd actually like to give out a shout out to Rashad, who might be here tonight, and Lumion, which is actually something I'm going to go play with over the next couple of weeks because it's a very promising studio rendering programs. Most studio rendering programs have steep learning curves. They can be expensive. Some are free, like Karakithya. What you have to do is you import your SketchUp model into the studio rendering program. And in general, this is an example by Akiko Okabe. She's a rendering artist at RNL. You could see what she's doing with 3ds Max. It's a gorgeous rendering. And in a lot of cases, the studio rendering programs might give you better result than integrated rendering programs, or IRPs. Here's Twilight, SU Podium, and Shaderlight. They have very simple learning curves. They work inside SketchUp. They're relatively affordable. They range from anywhere from $100 to $200. And if you learn how to use one, you learn how to use all of them. The process is really dependent on how well you model in SketchUp. What we're also seeing with these new integrated rendering programs, like Shaderlight, and there's going to be new generations of SU Podium and Twilight Render, is we're now looking at the 2nd and 3rd generations of these programs. They've gotten a lot of feedbacks from users. They've worked more integrated with the SketchUp itself, and their quality is becoming very superior, almost parallel to studio rendering programs. Again, the big difference between these programs is one works in SketchUp, one works outside of them. Some people will claim it's easier to use the studio rendering programs. I leave that up to you. I know that using the integrated rendering programs is a great stepping stone if you want to go start working with studio rendering programs like Lumion, like Karakithya, like 3ds Max. So again, here's the integrated rendering programs. This is Shaderlight, Twilight, Podium. These are what constitutes their menus in SketchUp. And don't be deceived even by the number of buttons on the Twilight render menu. You're only actually going to use 2 or 3 of them at a time. Here's a complete list. If you go to SketchUp's website, they don't have a complete list of studio rendering programs, but they have a pretty comprehensive list of other rendering programs you can use within SketchUp. So how is this process universal? How do I mean you can use any rendering program? And the key to it is how you use SketchUp and prepare your model. Well, here's a SketchUp model of your interior. We will get to exterior stuff as well, don't worry. But I take this SketchUp model and then I render it in all 3 rendering programs. So I took it and I rendered it in Twilight Render. And you can see there's one quality, and I changed the backgrounds up. I did a post-Photoshop for all the backgrounds through the windows in each rendering program, but this is Twilight. Or then I can take it into SU Podium, and you can start seeing the differences in the render quality a bit. Or you can do it in Shaderlight. Same model, 3 different rendering programs. That's why the process is universal. And I know I'm going to get asked, which one do I prefer? It depends. Each one has capabilities that I like, even ones that I'm not showing you in, like Render In, for example, or Maxwell Render. Each one does something different that I like. If I can combine them all into one program, I'd be happy. But in this case, I just end up using whichever one might seem appropriate for me at the time. Okay, so let's talk about texturing your SketchUp model. Texturing is the most important part of the process. Here, you're seeing this little alley. And I'm going to go to the next slide here. You're actually using the SketchUp paint bucket. I'm going to demonstrate that to apply materials, to scale materials. There's a lot you can do in SketchUp and how you make textures appear. But in this case, what you're seeing here is, again, this is the SketchUp model. The shadows are on. I'm setting the lightings, and I've turned the fog on. But I'm assessing the textures first and foremost. Why? Because I know if I can get it to look right in SketchUp prior to rendering, it's going to look fine while I render it. In this case, the textures for the ground plane are correctly scaled. I have textures for the brick that come across as looking semi-real or realistic in here. Same with the benches and all the details in place. That way I can assess what I know is going to, what it's going to look like prior, right before I render it, and then I just click the render button after I apply the values again, and you can see that it adds the reflection and a little bit of depth to the textures. But again, the key part is actually working with textures correctly in SketchUp. Well, how do you do that? Well, what are textures? Textures in SketchUp or materials are really just images. They're images of materials, they're plan view images, there's something called seamless and tiled images. I'm not going to get into too much detail about that because I could spend a whole hour talking just about textures. But all they are, these are the texture images in Photoshop, and they get applied to the model surfaces in SketchUp. And what SketchUp ends up doing is it tiles the image onto each surface to create the reality of the textures on the surfaces themselves. You know, and there are, this is what you're seeing, and you'll see it in a second. If it hasn't cut up, we'll wait for it. You're seeing the SketchUp material menu. By the way, just one note, there is a big difference between the PC versus the Mac version of the material menu. I'm focusing on the PC one. The Mac version, I'm going to have a free chapter on that online about how to use the Mac material menu because it's a bit more complicated. But SketchUp does come with its own native materials. They are useful for rendering, but they're limited. They're limited in number, so you can't really represent a wide variety or different types of textures, and they're limited in results. The reason why is they're lower resolution. They sometimes don't come out as well. One of the things that you have to do, and I'm going to emphasize this point with components as well, but textures as much as anything else, you need to build a texture library. What is a texture library? It's a folder that has subfolders that represent a wide variety of different materials, from asphalt to concrete to granite to flooring to wood to roofing to whatever. You can see here's an example of some of the materials that I have that represent a texture library. And then, for example, texture library brick, and you can see I have a whole selection of different types of brick textures that I use. How do I end up creating my texture library? I'll show you that as well. I'm going to give you some very specific resources for that next. But I do it on a per project basis. anytime I'm going to start working on a project or anything I'm going to do, I'll go download some textures, I'll organize them in the folder, and I can use them again later on, but slowly and surely you build up a texture library. There's a couple of really good places to get textures. One of them that I love is a website called cgtextures.com. And what it is you can see there's a bunch of categories on the left side. These are ideal and are directed for CG computer-generated graphics. Membership is free. You can download up to 10 megabytes of small textures a day. For a yearly subscription of $70, you can download 100 megabytes a day. Well, what's nice about SketchUp in that capacity is there's small, medium, and large texture sizes on CG Textures. You only need to download the small ones. Well, there's also another, I'd like to give out a shout out to my friend John Pasiga, who runs the SketchUp for Landscapes blog, and I'm going to actually give you that link in here as well. So give me 1 second as I switch out of PowerPoint. I apologize for that, but I just want to show you. Here's cgtextures.com. But then there's also John Pasiga's blog here, and a specific blog post. I'm going to put it in the chat window. And what he's done here is he's actually listing a ton of for-pay and hundreds of free texture websites. So you can actually go get your textures from this website, and he's got he just spent a lot of time getting all these textures organized into and you can see it just goes on and on. So if you don't want to get the for-pay ones, again, there's just tons of places to go get materials for SketchUp, so you can easily build your texture library, which again I highly recommend that you do. So that's where you can obtain textures. Let's talk about what you do with them. So the SketchUp material menu is key to actually using it, because you have to both use the select and you have to know how to edit textures as well, and it's something you have to get very familiar with this particular menu to use it correctly. Aside from that, there's a very specific way you want to actually model in SketchUp. You want to apply colors to everything in text in SketchUp. So let's say you start modeling your project, you're not really sure what the materials are going to be. Apply a solid SketchUp color to it. Why? You'll be able to take any solid SketchUp color and swap it out. If you go the route, and I know a lot of people do this when you model, and you don't apply any materials, you just use the default SketchUp material, which is really not a material, the problem with that is you cannot actually adjust those later and swap out the colors as easily. You have to go apply your materials to every nook and cranny within this model. That doesn't work well, and I'm going to demonstrate why in SketchUp in a second, but let's keep going with this. So here's an example image of this window and this staircase for this project in Denver called Taxi, and everything has a solid color that will represent a future material. So once the colors are applied as I'm modeling them, I can quickly go and swap them out. Again, this is in SketchUp. The edges are on, the shadows are visible, and you'll see that in 1 second as the view catches up. But with one click, I've actually swapped out the solid colors with a texture image. That's a quick way for me to edit it and actually go through the process of editing all these materials in SketchUp and applying them, and then I simply render it. This is rendered in Twilight, and then you can see the textures themselves get bumped up to a photorealistic level and give us the results that we want. So that's one of the most important aspects of actually rendering, and I'm going to switch out. I'm going to talk about this in SketchUp in some more detail here. So here's my SketchUp model, and let me just talk about this process real quickly. Here's my site design with my building, and you can see there's no colors applied to these surfaces. Before I extrude any of the surfaces, I apply a solid color to all the surfaces here. That way, when I start extruding surfaces, the extruded surfaces automatically take on the color and quality of the flat 2D surface. So it's a time saver. All the materials have color, and then all I have to do is I'm going to use the SketchUp Shadow material editor here. I'm going to take the eyedrop. I'm going to select my texture here, and then I'm going to go to Edit, and I'm going to say Use Texture Image. It's linked directly to my texture library. There's a way of doing that in SketchUp. And I'm going to go to my brick and stones, and I can pick any one of these bricks and stone. I'm going to select one, hit open, and it applies it automatically to the model. So that is the most important part of this process and how you're doing it. You can see all the solid colors in this part of this model have now been swapped out with a solid color. And again, if I'm going too fast with this, I apologize. There's a lot of information. You will get a link in the next couple of days to this video so you can rewatch it. The way to link SketchUp to your texture libraries, you go under Window, Preferences, Files, Texture Images. You link to there, you click on that, you browse to where your textures are, hit OK, and now whenever you select an image in SketchUp, or select, a color in SketchUp, and click on the Browse button or use Texture Image, you can then quickly swap it out. So for example, I'll take some gravel here, and you can see it swaps it out. So that's an important part of this process. I don't want that to go forgotten because it's relatively important. Okay, let's keep going since there's a lot more to go over. All right. So the next most important aspect of SketchUp is detailing. I see a lot of half-done models. People don't know where to get components, but it makes a big difference. So you can see this park is rendered, but I want to add some detail to it. Not too bad to do, not too hard to do. There's some very specific resources out there that all of a sudden allow you to bring life to this model. People, buildings that you don't have to model, cars, and additional components that let you really create very detailed models. Now, at the heart, again, of doing this, and I say this all the time to people, it's important, is creating a component library. In particular, you want to really create a very specific component library. It includes buildings, it includes bridges, and you build this over time, but instead of just creating your model and bringing in the details for that model, organization is key to actually this process and actually getting there some very specific detailings of building this component details. But there's so much out there that's available now that's inexpensive or free. For example, and before I jump into where to get those components, let's talk about the tools that you need to detail your model. There's three tools in particular that people don't use well or don't use enough or use but may not use it correctly, or I want to encourage you to use better. Is actually, one of them is the component browser in SketchUp. The component browser is like your internet browser. You can link the component browser, to your SketchUp library. Like textures, if you do it correctly, you can create favorites that allow you to automatically go into the organized folders of components and quickly insert detail into your model. That's very important. In tandem with that is using layers. I meet a lot of people right now that are using SketchUp proficiently, but everybody tells me that they're lazy when it comes to layers. All I can tell you is that the key and by far the most important aspect, especially for site design, is using layers in SketchUp because it controls both functionality, visibility, and maintains computer and SketchUp performance. I would not be able to build large models if I didn't use layers, and I'm going to actually show you a very specific example. The other thing on top of using layers is learning to use SketchUp Scenes. Using SketchUp Scenes, you can control layer visibility. What do I mean by that? Well, let's say you need to turn off layers or specific layers, and you have to go through the layer menu, select them, turn them on and off, and that can become a tedious process. What you can actually start doing is using SketchUp Scenes, and what SketchUp Scenes do is actually allow you to save a camera view, but it also lets you save layer visibility and shadow settings. So in this case, I create an off scene. I turn off all my detail. The off scene is created. Whenever I click on the off scene, it turns off all the detail I don't want. Similarly, I create an on scene. The on scene turns everything else on, so I don't have to interact with my layer menu beyond creating these scenes. And then I can also create very specific scenes. In this case, I keep all my detail. I just don't want any of the trees to be visible. This is an amazing shortcut for working in SketchUp. Not enough people do it. It's very efficient. You do have to organize and make sure that you use layers, and I also use a very specific set of layer conventions to do that in order to keep my models very organized. Why is that important? People always say I cannot build large models in SketchUp. This model that you're looking at is in SketchUp, has 180 million faces in it. It's enormous, and using layers I'm able to control it. Why is that important? Because then I can go render it, and I can create very scenic, very detailed scenes once they're rendered based off using layers and scenes and also the component browser and making sure that I get the right components that I want to use. And using the right components is important, but just to emphasize this, I'm a stickler for layers. Layers are highly important, and you can see why in this particular example. So let me just go through layers, scenes in detail fairly quickly, and I'm also going to show you links. I'm going to go to another model here. So here's that park model. I'm going to open up my layers here. It's a fairly extensive layer list, but it's not too bad. And you can see I have a variety of scenes set up to control the layers at the top here. So if I click the no trees scene, it will turn on all the, we'll give it a second, it will turn on all the detail in the model. It'll maintain some level of performance for me. Or I can go on and turn on everything, and it will let me, it'll turn on all the visible trees, all the visible detail in this model, hopefully without crashing my computer, because there is quite a good amount of detail in here. But using scenes in this capacity, and again, I'm going to click on the off scene here, and it will turn off all the information in the model. And that's so I don't have to interact with my layers beyond that, but that's really important and key to this modeling process. We'll let this catch up. You'll see the scene has everything off, or maybe not. SketchUp might not be processing that fast enough. I'm going to keep going. You'll see it on the rewind. Oh, there you go. Okay. So let's keep going with a little bit more about components. So there's 3 places I recommend to get components. One of them is 3D Warehouse, and people are like, oh God, 3D Warehouse. It's an unorganized mess. The SketchUp people know that. That's one of the things they're going to work on in the future. But one of the things that you can do in 3D Warehouse is get buildings. You can use these for your projects. You can use these for their renderings. I'm adding my own collection to these, but there's tons of buildings on here for context. They're excellent. I highly recommend creating a building collection off of 3D Warehouse, among other things. The next one is Form Fonts. $120 subscription lets you download 10,500 models a year. I do have an affiliation with Form Fonts for consulting, but I do not have an affiliation with them, honestly, with their models themselves. So I don't get any money off of or royalties off of their models, just to let you know. But I'm showing you a sampling of the type of stuff that I love to use. In particular, I want to emphasize 3 things. One, they have a ton of buildings. As important, if you do a search term on Form Fonts for something called photo figure, you will get these 2D people that are excellent for rendering. What do I mean by that? I use both 3D people and 2D people, but the 2D photo figures are awesome. So here's a rendering. I added people that are seated. Those are 3D people. And then I can add the photo people to the rendering. And again, these are all using Form Fonts. It's the best collection where you don't have to make your own people, but it's the best collection of photo people I've seen for rendering. I use them extensively, and they are constantly updating it. The other thing that I love in terms of generic vegetation is the search term on Form Fonts called Geometries. These are excellent for rendering. I've actually created my own trees off of these. I'm going to upload them for free for Form Fonts people to use. But what you can do with them is really great. They render really well. They're optimized for rendering, so they're not going to slow down your system as long as you use layers. But you can see the results here in terms of just being able to render with the geometries. So again, the geometries from Form Fonts. Okay, there's another place. This is a bit pricier. This is Sketch 3D from Dynascape. What Dynascape did, Len Hordick, their product manager, they created over 1,000 types of plants. They're organized by their Latin names, and they are excellent for rendering. I'm using them for prairie models right now. It is a bit pricier. Again, I don't have a direct association with them, but people always ask, where can we get tons of different plants? You go to Dynascape Sketch 3D, get your office to invest in them. They also have other models on there, but it's the best collection of plants I've ever seen for SketchUp, and they're optimized. There's 2D and 3D plants, there's trees, there's grasses, there's perennials, there's boulders, there's vines, there's pools, there's structures, but it's really intended for the landscape architecture and landscape design community. You can see an example of a rendering here. In a second, this is the taxi development. I just spruced it up for a presentation, and you can see some of the shrubs there. Okay, Let's keep going. Again, I'm on the whirlwind of information. So SketchUp Shadows equal exterior lighting. Learning how to use the SketchUp Shadow menu efficiently makes a big difference. Why? How you portray lighting in your models will make or break the presentation. A lot of people, if you have buildings in there, they'll cast too much light into it. But you can adjust the SketchUp shadows very easily to get varying results in your models. And this is important because you use lighting to create emphasis and focus in your renderings. So for example, I went with the final setting here for the USDA building on the mall to create the rendering for that, and the way I use the textures. There's some other ways you want to use shadows in SketchUp. I'm not going to go into that, but the simplest thing to know to do exterior lighting in rendering, you actually just use the SketchUp shadow menu and play around with it to get to results. And we're going to talk about that again here. So here's in Abu Dhabi, I think, a project for a promenade. You could see this, it's rendered. You see the SketchUp, the shadows were set so the buildings were casting the shadow versus adjusting the SketchUp shadows to get an entirely different result, to highlight the contrast in the building, to allow you to see the promenade in this particular case. So learning how to use the SketchUp shadow menu is fairly important, but it's also the easiest way to set up lighting for any kind of rendering. You can also use the SketchUp shadows to cast into a building, into a scene, to illuminate a scene. In this case, I'm casting the shadow into the rendering, and you can see that it's actually lighting up the interior in that particular case. So that's the process. That's the first part of the process. That's really the modeling part, and that's really the most work you're going to do. If you're already SketchUp modeling, some of that should be familiar, and you just want to tweak it. Then you have the iterative rendering process. It's 2 steps, and this is the process you're going to go through to actually create your renderings. The first step is applying values. These are literally numeric values or named values to textures. You set the output resolution and quality, and you confirm lighting. You're not doing anything else with lighting. You're just going to confirm it, and that's a really easy step. Then step 2 is running the drafts. You make adjustments to the model based off the drafts. The reason why you're doing this is you're going to run your drafts at lower settings. So you're not waiting 10 minutes or 20 minutes for a rendering. You're waiting 1 minute for a rendering, making the adjustments that you want, and then you steadily increase the quality and the resolution as you start producing the drafts. But let's go through this process. So let's talk about textures first. So one of the values you apply to SketchUp using these rendering programs is called bump. Bump, for the best term, is called 3D contrast. You can see that I'm adjusting the bump value on this concrete, on this cube, and it's actually creating depth in and along the creases of the scoring and giving the stone some texture. A little bit of bump goes a long way. You could see at a value of +7 or +8. This is in Shaderlight. I'm actually the applied texture, again, this was a texture applied in SketchUp. You're giving it a numeric value, and then it renders in a particular way, and that in essence is what is bump. Here's an example. This is a texture in SketchUp of brick. I apply some bump value to it, and then I render it, and you can see that it starts giving it some depth and some coarseness to actually make it look more realistic. So that's what bump does, and bump is a universal value in all the rendering programs you'll ever see for the most part, and how you apply them. And you can see here some examples of rendered hard surfaces in SketchUp, rendered in Shaderlight, and they were all given some bump, and you can see the result in what they're doing in terms of having bump. The next thing is actually a range of diffusion and reflection. So everything in the real world cast or absorb light, and you want to give that value, and that's the other set of values you give in these rendering programs, is you're going to give them a range of diffusion to reflection. So for example, this is in SketchUp. I applied values to them, and I'll give you an example. I'll do a little bit of hands-on of showing how do I apply values, and then I render it, and you can see what happens when I render it. The granite has a little bit of subtle reflection. The surfaces are polished to mirrored, and that's the range of reflections that you're giving to values in SketchUp. I'm going to go back to this particular concrete and hard surface images and just talk about that for a second. Even these surfaces were given a range of reflection and diffusion. Everything reflects. If you walk around the real world, you'll be amazed at the type of reflections are in the real world. And I'm going to talk about that here in this example of the Utah teapot, which is an icon for rendering. But I have paint, I have my glossy wood surface, and I have the ceramic of the teapot itself. Well, I've given everything a separate value, so the paint has a little bit of reflection, a little bit of bump, but not a lot, but enough to make it shine. Then the teapot itself is given more reflection, where you can actually see bits and pieces of the background in it starting to become reflective. And then finally, there's the gloss on the table itself. That's not a full reflection. It's a little bit more diffuse. It's less reflective than the teapot, but more reflective than the paint. So those are the ranges you're giving it. To give you another example of the range of reflection you can give in SketchUp. So watch the mirror in the background. You could see a very slight haze of reflection in it, of the car and the teapot in it, and then I apply a different value to it, and this is just some of the ranges. The ranges are incredible in terms of reflection, and you could start seeing a little bit more of the reflection all the way up. I'm starting to add a more reflective value to that surface, so it's reflecting more of the surroundings. Just a little bit more, this starts taking on a little bit of a mirrored reflection, all the way to a final mirrored reflection, 100% reflection. So that's what you're really doing to these textures with these rendering programs. You're applying values of diffusion and reflection, and then coarseness, which is what bump is. So one final example, this is an SU Podium of all the different reflection values applied here to the car paint, these floating balls. This is just a test model for myself to test the different levels of reflection all the way through the entire model. And then you can give different adjustments. I'm not going to go into details. I want to do this in a different webinar on how you do water. So still water reflection versus water that's a bit more turbulent but still reflective and transparent, all the way to non-reflective and turbulent water. Same thing with glass. Those have different reflections, but again, I'm going to go through some very specific texture values as well in a second. So just to really talk about how this works in terms of how you apply rendering values, you can see here's my SketchUp model. The textures are applied. This is the Shaderlight menu. I'm going to open up the Shaderlight material menu. This is where I apply bump. You can see bump is at the bottom here. And then I have a bunch of preset material settings that let me determine how reflective or diffuse. I use the SketchUp eyedropper. I'm going to select the ground plane, or actually I'll select the brick here, or something else that doesn't just give me a smooth, everything is going to be smooth. But here what you can basically do is you can select from matte, satin, shiny, gloss. Actually, I'm using the wrong model. Here we go. Here's the right model. There we go. So I'm going to select the windows here. It'll come back. It's going to say transparent, thin glass, and that's how you apply all these settings. I want to jump back into my PowerPoint presentation because I want to talk about specific settings here. And this is where you'll want to review this video. So here's a general chart about how materials work in SketchUp. These are not specific to rendering programs. This chart is intended as a primer. So for example, brush metal has an uneven to smooth condition, has a hazy to clear reflection, and bump can be smooth to coarse. How does that translate, for example, into something like Shaderlight? These are Shaderlight specific settings for this particular rendering. CMU, I'm using a very specific reflection type of satin. The finish is high 1. Without going into a lot of detail, I'm actually giving a range of reflection to all these materials. And again, you can use these for your own renderings. Watch this video again. Pause it. I'm giving you specific settings for metal, for stucco, for CMU, for awnings, for glass. Just to keep going, here's the next image for bike metal, for street poles, for concrete paving, for signs, the whole gamut of the typical range of materials you're going to find in a model. And for anybody that's doing interior renderings, I love doing interior renderings. In some ways they're easier to do than actual exterior renderings in terms of making them look more realistic. Here's examples of more settings for you to use. Again, I'm going to pause here for a second, so if you watch this video again, you can actually come back. And these are specific to Shaderlight, not to the other rendering programs. And again, I don't want to get too much into the book and what that means, but I will provide more of that information in the book. So the You apply your texture values, so how your textures render. Then the next thing you do is you're going to apply a resolution to the render. Resolution is just height and width. So for example, this is the Denver Justice Center, a pixel width of 2750 by 2400. What does that actually mean? Your letter size correspond to a DPI that correspond to an output resolution, which is what you want to actually do for your rendering programs. So if you want a 150 DPI image at 11 by 17, it's 1650 by 2550 as a pixel resolution output. But you do want to use the lower settings because the lower the resolution, the quicker the render. We're going to keep going and talking about that. We're going to talk about the other thing, which is quality. The other value that you apply in step 1 is the quality of the rendering. This is a low quality rendering setting. It's actually at the lowest, and that lets me assess the materials and the textures by having a quickly done render. I'm not rendering at a high quality. I can go to my next level of quality after I've made some adjustments, all the way to my final quality, my final level, my 100% quality output once I'm ready to do the final output. So then the last value you're going to apply, again, is lighting. And again, we talked about the SketchUp Shadow menu. Each one of these rendering programs, Twilight, Shaderlight, Podium, and all the rest of them have something called physical sky as a setting. If you set physical sky in these rendering programs, you're telling them to use the SketchUp Shadow menu for lighting. So I set physical sky. Here's the image again. I've got my SketchUp Shadows set in a specific direction. You can see they're going to the right. And then the rendering program will pick that up and duplicate that exact setting. So that's the first step of the rendering process, is setting these values and then setting quality, resolution, and the texture values. I'm going to skip this for right now just because I'd like to keep going instead of doing that demonstration. I want to talk about step 2. So iterative draft process. So step 2 is you're going to run a series of draft renders. During this process, you're adjusting texture values or you're swapping out textures that don't work with an entirely new texture. You're also going to adjust the camera angles. You're going to adjust the lighting to tweak it. All these adjustments are done in SketchUp. And as you go from draft render 1 through 8, you steadily increase the quality. You steadily increase the resolution, and you steadily increase the level of detail. You start out with low quality, low resolution, and no detail using layers. You turn off trees, benches, shrubs, whatever, and that produces a quick rendering. So for example, why? So low resolution equals faster render, low detail equals faster render, and low quality equals faster render. So here's my first draft render. It's the initial drafts, low quality, low resolution, the component detail is off, and I can start assessing what I want to do, what needs to change in this rendering. Then I keep running additional renderings. I keep the resolution and the quality settings low, but I start adding more detail to it. Still not a lot, and what I mean by adding detail is I'm turning some of my layers on. So my layers with my benches are on, and it's not a noticeable increase in render time, and I can start making adjustments to this. So in this particular case, I don't like the reflection of my windows. I might not like the texture, so I'll keep going from there. And I keep running additional renders really quickly, making my adjustments. In this case, I don't like my pedestrian lights. I ended up adjusting them by the time I got to my 4th render. And in this case, I've started to increase the quality. The image is less grainy, lower resolution still, but more detail is visible. Then I get to my secondary drafts. In this case, I've increased the quality, I've increased the resolution, and there's more detail available. So I have the sculpture visible, I have my table and chairs visible. All are high polygon, so they do make a difference in terms of impacting render times. And this might seem like it's complex, but it's not. Really, the key to it is making sure your SketchUp model is organized with layers and everything's layered correctly. And then I finally keep going. I add more detail to the time I'm doing my 6th render, my 7th render, and then I finally get to my last render before I do my final. In this case, I've adjusted my camera angle, I've adjusted my lighting, all my window reflections are correct, my background's nice, and that will let me go to my final, my semi-final, and my final rendering. And before I jump into the rest of that, I am going to go into these settings real quickly and show you what I mean by applying output. So 2 menus on Shaderlight that are important, and it's similar for SU Podium and Twilight Render and Maxwell and Render In, material menu and output. This is the render button, this is for animations, and this does simulated lighting. We're not going to worry about those. Real quickly, here's my output, so I can set my resolution at the top. So I have preset resolutions, again, lower resolution, faster render. Then I have a quality bar that ranges literally from 1 to 10 or low to high. And the lower the quality, the faster the render. And you can see this is set for 1920 by 1080, high quality rendering, and you could see the physical sky setting. These are the most important aspects of it in terms of what you're trying to do for setting up your draft render quality. Also, the other thing that a lot of rendering programs do, if you notice, is you can insert background images for skies or context into these menus and render them out. So let's go back into my presentation here and then kind of just wrap it up and go see if I can get to the Trimble stuff. So once I'm done, this is one aspect of it. I take my final image, I bring it into Photoshop. In this case, what I'm doing is I'm adding some haze to the image. I tweak colors, I tweak entourage, I tweak saturation. I'll show you that, but there you can see I added some haze. Here's another example. This is a rendered image. I end up inserting an image into it. We'll let you catch up there for a second. And then it allows me to insert my sky in Photoshop. That's the other way of doing it if you don't insert the background image into the rendering program. I also don't like my ground plane, so I'll actually add some lawn or additional vegetation in, both in the foreground and in the background of the hill to create my final rendered image. This is a project in China. So that's what you want to do with Photoshop, and Photoshop for a lot of rendering artists say is the key to actually getting more real results. You adjust hue, adjust contrast, add entourage, add backgrounds, atmosphere, and there's a litany of other things that you can do. There's other things you can do with these rendering programs just to answer the question. You can create simulated lighting. So in this case, I add light bulbs, and I create a lighted scene. You can definitely do this with almost all these programs. Here's an exterior render with lighting on it in itself for a residential project. And again, I personally have, this is Carolette in my own model of an interior, and I really greatly enjoy that. And again, there's a lot of different types of lighting options you can do. You can use these for exterior scenes as well to create spotlight results. This is a little art gallery concept. I like to create test models that are low poly so I can really play with settings. And I'm just going to go through this real quick and